Daniel Hannan. I'm the president of the institute that's launched today. We will be there to make the ethical case for open markets and unrestricted commerce as the supreme instrument of poverty alleviation, of social justice, and of conflict resolution. And I hope to use Britain's new relationship with the European Union in such a way as to revitalise the global trading system. Let me begin by thanking the board members of the Institute for Free Trade, our chairman, John Moynihan, our vice chairman, Alan Halsall, and all of the others who are supporting us. And let me make if I can be so bold, a broader expression of thanks on behalf of all the politicians in this room to all of the businessmen and entrepreneurs in this room. I'm glad to say the whole of the IFT board are entrepreneurs. Thank you. We're very good, we politicians, at saying thanks to nurses and teachers and soldiers, and quite right, so we should be. But I wish we would sometimes be a little bit more forthcoming about saying thank you to the people who generate all the surplus that pays for the nurses and the teachers and the soldiers and us. Yeah. So, on behalf of all the MPs here from Britain and from elsewhere, thank you to all of you who generate that surplus in the private sector. Ladies and gentlemen, the easiest thing is to take for granted what is familiar to us. And it's sometimes a real effort of will to stand back and see the wonder of the world in which we live. The astonishing rate of wealth, health, and happiness increasing in the course of our lifetimes. For 10,000 years, the lot of most human beings was oppression and caste, serfdom and slavery. Most human beings scratched out a meagre life of bare subsistence, working dawn to dusk in the fields. But in the last 200 years, something truly miraculous happened. We underwent a great enrichment, which is the central fact of your life and of mine. The fact that you're in this room is enough to tell me that. And what was the secret that lay behind that great enrichment? It was that we stopped trying to be self-sufficient, whether at personal or tribal or national level, and learned to depend on strangers. From that simple change in our behaviour came Starbucks and starships and symphonies and smallpox vaccines. If I think of the extraordinary changes in my lifetime, I was born in 1971. In 1971, it took the average British worker more than a month to be able to buy a television set. Now it's less than 2 days. 1971, fewer than half of girls completed primary education. Now, it's more than 90%. In 1971, a stationary car emitted more pollution than a car today moving at full speed. What was the magic wand that brought about an extraordinary transformation? Free exchange. The knowledge in the cloud that allows us to specialize and to depend on extended networks. So why can't we see it? How is it, when that record is so obvious, that we have, as we saw today with the Bombardier decision, we have in every country a tendency to pull in the other direction, to be self-harming with protectionist restrictions and the promotion of vested interests? It seems to me that there are three problems that we have to overcome here. The first is that there is a psychological resistance to free trade. We have the instincts of hunter-gatherers. On the savannas of Pleistocene Africa, we learned to be self-sufficient. We wanted to provide against famine, to hoard. We resent the idea of dependence on others, which is at the root of the market system. Although free trade works in practice, it's running up against 1 million years of evolution encoded in our genomes. Then there's what I can only call an aesthetic objection. I see it every day in my children's home. All of these stories about terrible sweatshops in Vietnam or wherever run by evil Western companies that exploit people. It's a very, very first world way of looking at development. I was brought up in Lima, which was ringed by what we would call shanty towns. I see the Peruvian ambassador here. He'll know that the Limeños call them las barriadas, the barriadas. Every time we had visitors coming from the West, they would always, after a few weeks, they would say, why do people move from these beautiful Andean villages and come and live among the sewage and the fumes and the dirt and squalor of these slums? As I say, it's a very first world question. No Peruvian ever needed to ask why people would leave a village where there's no electricity, where there's no running water, there's no school, there's no clinic. And what our children's geography textbooks don't tell them is that these are transitional. The best thing you can do to get people out of those shanty towns is to buy their produce. The people working for foreign companies in these countries generally earn a lot more than the average wage. That's the aesthetic objection. The great Victorian novelist Anthony Trollope said, poverty, to be scenic, should be rural. And that, I think, lies behind a lot of the developed world's suspicion of free trade. But the real problem, and I think all the politicians in this room will appreciate it, the real problem is the political one. And that political problem can be summarized in 4 words. Free trade brings dispersed gains, concentrated losses. It seems to me unarguable that if, for example, the decision on Boeing and Bombardier goes through, that the main losers will not actually be workers in Northern Ireland, but will be American consumers in the American aviation industry. Because more jobs are always destroyed, many more, than each one that you create. Sugar prices in the US are about twice world levels. A small number of strategic jobs in sugarcane plantations in Florida are created. 7 to 11 jobs for each of those is lost in food processing. Have steel tariffs, you lose many more jobs in construction, in aviation, automotives, and so on. But the people whose jobs don't exist don't know who they are by definition, right? Their jobs exist only in the subjunctive. They can't lobby in the way that the vested interests can. And that's why we politicians are always under pressure from old industries blocking new ones. So what's the answer? Well, I'm looking at the High Commissioner of Singapore here. The answer is just to do it. Just do it. The year that Singapore became independent, GDP per head in Singapore was slightly less than half of what it was in the UK. Now it's nearly twice as much. Singaporeans have gone from being half as rich as us to being twice as rich as us over a period of 50-something years. How? Singapore has no resources. It depends on imports for everything. It has even to bring in its own drinking water. What was the magic formula? They simply dropped their barriers. They invited the traffic and commerce of the world without restrictions, and in consequence, they went from being a steamy and tropical island into being the gleaming city-state that we all enjoy visiting today. Same thing, I see people here from the New Zealand High Commission, they've gone through the same process. The Australian High Commissioner is here, starting very slightly later, but always the same story. That's the answer, just do it. Which brings us to where we are now, the unfrozen moment, the opportunities that come from Brexit. It's not every day that a country of our size gets to draw up a new trade policy from scratch. The Singapore trade policy made Singapore very rich, but I hope the High Commissioner won't take this amiss when I say that it made only a slight dent on the world economy, given the relative size of Singapore. But the 5th or 6th biggest economy on the planet doing something similar, there are potentially gains for everyone. There are politicians and ambassadors in this room representing some 40 countries, some in the European Union, some outside. But all of us, I think, have an interest in having a prosperous world based on the free movement of goods and ideas. We, of all countries, should understand this. The United Kingdom invented free trade, both in theory in the writings of Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and then in practice from the 1840s, unilaterally removing its trade barriers and becoming, in consequence, the wealthiest country in the world. Until, and this is the really good news, others copied us and caught up, greatly to our benefit. If we did it before, we can do it again. What raised us once to greatness will do so a second time. So, ladies and gentlemen, I have 3 people who are going to speak to us tonight, 2 British ministers and 1 foreign minister of a friendly country. And let me first of all hand over to our host here in the Foreign Office, our Foreign Secretary.